Under a grey February sky, 1945, the war's dying months, snow fell in clumps across a wrecked German village west of the Rhine. The streets were silent, lined with burned-out trucks and collapsed roofs. A lone church bell dangled twisted from its frame. Then from the fog came the distant rumble of engines. Civilians, women clutching infants, old men dragging carts, froze in place as olive-drab silhouettes emerged through the smoke. American half-tracks rolled in, their .50 caliber barrels glinting under patches of pale sunlight. But something unexpected happened. Instead of the sharp command to raise hands or the thunder of gunfire, the G.I.s stepped down with open palms. They weren't aiming rifles, they were passing out food. Cans of Spam, powdered milk, chocolate bars, and cigarettes. To the civilians, it made no sense. For years, the word Americana had been synonymous with terror, with air raids that turned cities into ash. Yet here, in the ruins of Germany, the supposed monsters were offering bread. Bundesarchiv Civilian Diary, Feb 1945. No one could have predicted this moment 5 years earlier, when the Wehrmacht marched into Poland and Germany believed itself invincible. Now the Reich was collapsing under the weight of its own ambitions. Cities like Cologne and Dresden were piles of stone. Railways were shattered. Millions of civilians wandered the roads, displaced, hungry, terrified of what awaited them when the Allies arrived. Propaganda had painted the Americans as brutal occupiers who would show no mercy. Goebbels' speeches warned of Negro and Jewish invaders who would slaughter the innocent. And yet, as American columns advanced through the West, reports trickled in of something that defied those nightmares. "The Americans feed the children," one captured letter read, intercepted by German counterintelligence. German Postal Censorship Archive, Mar 1945. In truth, the Americans had been preparing for this moment since before D-Day. Psychological warfare wasn't just about leaflets and radio. It was about conduct. Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, CHEF, had issued strict orders. Soldiers were to treat civilians humanely, distinguishing them from combatants. This was not a moral luxury. It was strategy. A fed population would resist less, cooperate more, and reveal valuable intelligence. CHEF Directive 1067A 1944. Yet on the ground, the transformation was deeply personal. Many G.I.s, some barely 20, had grown up in the Great Depression. They knew hunger. They'd seen mothers skipping meals so children could eat. So when they entered towns where German families rummaged through rubble for bread, empathy, not hatred, rose first. That didn't mean the situation was calm. In the first days after crossing the Rhine, chaos ruled. Refugees clogged every road, Wehrmacht stragglers hid among civilians, and snipers picked off unwary patrols. American commanders struggled to balance security with compassion. Units like the 104th Timberwolf Division in the Ruhr and the 3rd Armored near Cologne established temporary refugee zones, guarded by MPs, where civilians could receive basic rations. Those rations, K-rations and C-rations repurposed from combat supplies, became symbols of mercy. Inside each box, biscuits, powdered coffee, a tin of hash, sometimes even chewing gum. Children lined up for it, wide-eyed. One G.I. later wrote, "They looked at us like we were from another planet." Soldiers who fed, not killed. U.S. Army Oral History, 1947. But even kindness had its cost. Many American troops found themselves conflicted. Only weeks earlier, they had fought ferocious battles in the Hürtgen Forest and the Ardennes, losing friends to German machine guns and artillery. Some had seen civilians cheering SS units as they retreated. Others stumbled upon camps, concentration camps that erased all illusions about innocence. Yet when the moment came, when a starving child tugged at a sleeve or an elderly woman collapsed beside a wagon, instinct took over. Compassion transcended rage. U.S. Chaplain Corps Memoir 1946. Eisenhower understood the optics. Cameras from the Army Signal Corps captured scenes of soldiers distributing rations, patching up wounded civilians, guiding mothers across rivers of debris. These images, later shown in newsreels back home, reshaped public perception. They weren't just liberators, they were humanitarians in uniform. For the Germans, especially civilians conditioned by years of Nazi control, it was psychological whiplash. "They are not what we were told," one woman wrote in her diary from Kassel. "They smile. They share their food. They even play with the children. Bundesarchiv Diary Collection, April 1945. Yet beneath the surface, this kindness served a deeper operational logic. Every chocolate bar handed out was a seed of trust. Intelligence officers soon found that civilians who'd been treated well were more willing to reveal the locations of minefields, supply dumps, and SS holdouts. In some villages, American patrols avoided ambushes because locals warned them beforehand. Feeding became a weapon, one that disarmed hate and turned despair into compliance. U.S. Counterintelligence Corps report, Ma 1945. Still, not every encounter ended peacefully. Isolated incidents of looting or abuse occurred, as in every army, but commanders were swift to punish offenders to preserve the broader image. "We cannot win peace through cruelty," Eisenhower reportedly told staff officers after reports of misconduct near Remagen. Schaff Minutes, Ma 1945. The message was clear. America's strength was not just its tanks or bombers, it was its moral authority. The front line had shifted from trenches to hearts and minds. By April, as Allied forces pushed deeper into central Germany, entire towns surrendered without resistance, waving white sheets from windows. In many, the first request wasn't for freedom, it was for food. American field kitchens worked non-stop, ladling soup for civilians and prisoners alike. German doctors, once loyal to the Reich, now stood beside U.S. medics treating frostbitten children. And everywhere disbelief lingered. "Why do they help us?" a captured Volkssturm fighter asked an interpreter. "Because the war is over," the interpreter replied, "and they want to make sure it never starts again." Interrogation transcript. U.S. 9th Army, April 1945. The impact of those small acts spread quickly. From Aachen to Leipzig, word traveled, "The Americans share their rations." It softened resistance before battles even began. Where German propaganda had promised slaughter, compassion arrived instead. In the eyes of many civilians, that single contrast between bullets and bread signaled the death of Nazi ideology more powerfully than any speech could. A psychological warfare branch analysis, May 1945. But behind every smile and ration tin lay exhaustion. American logistics were stretched thin, their supply lines feeding not only millions of troops, but now hundreds of thousands of German civilians. Quartermasters scrambled to keep up, rerouting food convoys through newly captured ports. Engineers built makeshift distribution centers from bombed-out warehouses. Every truckload of flour diverted to feed Germans meant one less for advancing soldiers. Yet the policy held. Feeding the defeated was part of victory itself. U.S. Army Quartermaster Report, Heber 1945. By the end of April, as the Allies closed in on Berlin, one image summed up the moment. A group of children sitting on a Sherman tank, eating chocolate, laughing as soldiers handed out candy bars. Around them, the ruins of the Reich smoldered. It was surreal, almost biblical, the conqueror breaking bread with the conquered. For many Germans, it was the first taste of peace in 6 years. Yet what the civilians couldn't yet see was the machinery behind that compassion, the logistical genius, the psychological calculus, and the moral gamble that made it possible. Because feeding an enemy was never just mercy, it was strategy. And behind that strategy lay one of the most ambitious humanitarian operations ever conducted in the midst of war. It began not with charity, but with calculation. By late 1944, the U.S. Army had realized that feeding the German population was not merely an act of mercy, but an operational necessity. Every civilian fed was one less potential saboteur, one less drain on military security. Behind the scenes, engineers, logisticians, and planners transformed compassion into precision. The Quartermaster Corps, under General Edmund B. Gregory, began expanding its civil affairs supply program, a logistical machine built to sustain millions of people across a ruined continent. U.S. Quartermaster General Report, DEC 1944. The first challenge was simple yet colossal: how to deliver calories faster than destruction could consume them. American supply depots in Antwerp and Cherbourg were already strained feeding Allied armies, over 3 million men scattered across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Yet orders came from Chef headquarters to allocate rations specifically for German civilians once territories fell. This required re-engineering the flow of supplies, entire convoys diverted from combat consumption to humanitarian relief. Each 1 to 2 ton deuce-and-a-half truck could carry about 5,000 individual rations. To feed one small German town of 20,000 people for a week, at least 140 trucks were required, moving through wrecked bridges, landmined roads, and unmarked front lines. Transportation Corps data, Feb 1945. It wasn't just logistics, it was science. The U.S. Army's Subsistence Research Laboratory in Chicago had spent years perfecting field rations that could survive cold, heat, and moisture. Now those same rations, K-rations, C-rations, and later 10-in-1 packs, became the cornerstone of civilian relief. The K-ration, designed by Dr. Ansel Keys in 1941, delivered roughly 3,000 calories a day in 3 boxed meals: biscuits, cheese spread, powdered drink, and chocolate. To a German child in April 1945, it tasted like heaven. Technical Manual TM 10405, 1943. Still, feeding civilians in an occupied land was no simple handout. It required command structure. Enter the Civil Affairs Division, a unit of soldiers fluent in law, engineering, and governance. Many were former professors, lawyers, and social workers who traded briefcases for helmets. They coordinated with the Allied Military Government, AMG, to organize ration distribution, enforce fair trade, and prevent black markets. In places like Aachen, Cologne, and Kassel, AMG officers worked with local mayors, some newly appointed after Nazi officials fled, to establish ration kitchens. These were guarded by MPs, supplied by quartermaster trucks, and staffed by German volunteers under American supervision. Each person received a ration card. Each card meant survival. Civil Affairs Directive No. 5, 1945. On the German side, confusion reigned. Wehrmacht commanders retreating east left behind shattered supply networks and starving civilians. Goebbels' propaganda machine insisted that Allied food was poisoned, meant to finish the job the bombers began. But hunger was stronger than fear. Within days, rumors spread through the ruins. The Americans give bread. They give milk to the children. Villagers ventured out with white flags and cooking pots, and soon long lines formed near U.S. camps. Dramatized composite. "I thought they would shoot us," one woman later said. Instead, the soldier smiled and gave me a can marked United States Army. Bundesarchiv, civilian interview collection. What few civilians knew was how dangerous those first days were for the Americans, too. In many towns, SS remnants hid among refugees, waiting for opportunities to strike. G.I.s feeding civilians often did so under sniper fire. Some units improvised defenses by positioning tanks around food lines. It felt like running a soup kitchen in a minefield, one lieutenant recalled. U.S. 104th Division After-Action Report, Mar 1945. Despite that, morale among troops rose. Acts of kindness offered brief relief from months of brutal combat. Soldiers who'd stormed the Siegfried Line found unexpected humanity in handing bread to those who once cheered their enemy. The logistics of compassion required engineering genius. American supply depots converted wrecked German rail cars into mobile kitchens. Engineers from the 348th Engineer General Service Regiment installed portable stoves, fuel lines, and water filtration units capable of serving thousands of meals daily. They used captured Wehrmacht warehouses to store flour and canned goods, guarded by MPs to deter looting. To ensure safety, all food distributed to civilians underwent inspection for contamination or sabotage, a task assigned to the U.S. Army Medical Corps. Bureau of Public Health Report, Heppes 1945. In March, as U.S. forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, a new front opened, mass displacement. Tens of thousands of civilians poured westward, fleeing Soviet advance or seeking safety under American control. The U.S. 9th Army's field kitchens were overwhelmed. The solution came from innovation. Mobile ration plants established near Koblenz and Trier. Using prefabricated units and field conveyors, these plants repacked bulk, Army supplies into smaller family-sized rations labeled food for civilian use only. It was the first time in history that a modern army established a humanitarian supply chain within an active combat zone. U.S. Army Service Forces, Logistics Bulletin No. 212, April 1945. Then came the turning point, the Battle of the Ruhr Pocket. Between March and April 1945, Allied forces encircled over 300,000 German troops in the industrial heartland. As the fighting ended, hundreds of thousands of civilians found themselves trapped among the ruins of Essen, Dortmund, and Düsseldorf. Food stocks had vanished. Water systems were destroyed. American commanders faced an impossible equation: feed the civilians or feed the troops. The solution was to merge both efforts. Truck convoys delivering ammunition on the way in carried flour and tinned meat on the way out. Engineers built makeshift bakeries using salvaged German ovens. In Essen alone, over 2 million loaves of bread were baked under U.S. supervision during April. Military Government Weekly Summary, April 1945. At the height of operations, the numbers were staggering. The U.S. Army distributed over 27,000 tons of food per week to civilians in occupied Germany, enough to feed nearly 3 million people. Quartermaster officers like Colonel James H. Stratton coordinated convoys stretching miles long, protected by armed escorts and signaled through field radio networks. Civilian cooperation improved dramatically. Villages began guiding American units around roadblocks, offering intelligence about hidden SS cells. The act of feeding had turned into a weapon of stabilization. Allied Control Council Food Report, May 1945. Yet not everyone approved. Some Allied officers feared that generosity would be mistaken for weakness. "We should not feed the enemy until he learns he is defeated," one British general remarked in frustration. But the Americans persisted. Eisenhower's philosophy was clear. To rebuild Germany, one must first feed it. Hunger was the seedbed of hatred, and the next war could begin in an empty stomach. Chef Correspondence, April 1945. On the ground, the transformation was visible everywhere. Children chased trucks shouting, "Chocolade!" Elderly women blessed soldiers handing out canned soup, and entire towns began to see the Americans not as conquerors, but as saviors. News of this behavior spread across Europe, contrasting sharply with the brutality of the Eastern Front. In Soviet-occupied zones, starvation persisted. In the West, Americans shared what little they had. The moral impact was immediate and irreversible. Still, behind every smiling GI stood a system of unrelenting calculation: spreadsheets, tonnage tables, fuel equations. Compassion, after all, was rationed like ammunition. And as spring turned to summer, the operation's true scale became clear. The world's most powerful army had fed its former enemy into submission, not with bullets, but with bread. What the Germans didn't know was that this unprecedented generosity was only the beginning. In the months to come, the feeding of Germany would evolve into a cornerstone of America's post-war strategy, a mission that would shape the balance of power for decades to follow. By May 1945, the guns fell silent, but the real battle was only beginning, a war against hunger, chaos, and despair. Across Germany's shattered landscape, over 60 million civilians faced starvation. The Allied armies, especially the Americans, now bore a burden unlike any before in history: to feed the nation they had just defeated. Eisenhower knew the stakes. "Victory means nothing if the peace starves," he wrote in a dispatch to Washington. Schaff Cable, May 1945. What followed was not conquest but reconstruction, a campaign fought with trucks, spoons, and the quiet heroism of logistics. In the first weeks after surrender, U.S. military government teams moved swiftly. Civil affairs officers, many still wearing dusty uniforms from the front, took over town halls and began assessing the damage. Bridges were gone, railways twisted, farms burned, warehouses empty. The Nazis had stripped their own countryside bare to sustain their armies, leaving civilians with little but ration cards and rubble. American engineers and planners realized that unless Germany was stabilized, chaos would swallow the victory whole. So they did what American soldiers had always done. They built. Within weeks, the U.S. Army established the German Food Mission, coordinating with the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, and the Red Cross. Convoys rolled in, carrying flour, beans, and canned meat, most of it sourced from American farms. Each ton was recorded, guarded, and rationed with mathematical precision. U.S. Army Service Forces, June 1945. The psychological transformation was profound. Germans who had once feared the barbaric invader now stood in lines for bread baked by American ovens. Children learned their first English words from ration labels: milk, sugar, chocolate. civilians began to see the stars and stripes as a symbol not of occupation, but of survival. In destroyed cities like Frankfurt and Nuremberg, American soldiers shared their mess halls with orphans, built makeshift schools, and reopened water systems using captured Wehrmacht pumps. It wasn't altruism alone. It was deliberate strategy. Feeding Germany meant preventing rebellion, preserving order, and laying the groundwork for democracy. Civil Affairs Handbook, July 1945. Behind the scenes, Eisenhower's staff debated how far compassion should go. Morgenthau's earlier hard peace plan, designed to deindustrialize Germany, was collapsing under the weight of humanitarian reality. "We cannot feed Europe if we let Germany starve," argued General Lucius D. Clay, the deputy military governor. Clay understood what few policymakers yet grasped, that starvation breeds extremism. His reasoning would later form the backbone of American post-war doctrine, stability through sustenance. Clay Memorandum, Aug. 1945. The numbers were staggering. Between May 1945 and January 1946, the U.S. Army distributed over 2 million tons of food in the American occupation zone alone. Each calorie was calculated to prevent famine but avoid dependency. 1,550 calories per person per day, the bare minimum for survival. It was a delicate moral equation, mercy balanced against scarcity. The same army that once bombed German railways now repaired them to deliver bread. Allied Control Council Food Report, 1946. For the soldiers who remained behind, the psychological shift was equally immense. Men who had stormed Normandy or crossed the Rhine now found themselves running soup kitchens, rebuilding bridges, and comforting the very people they once fought. Many described it as the Second War, a war for decency. "It was harder than fighting," recalled Sergeant Bill Hansen of the 29th Division. "When you see a hungry kid with eyes too big for his face, you forget the uniform he used to salute." Veterans' Oral History. 1947, this new front, fought in kitchens, barns, and supply depots, proved decisive in shaping the moral balance of the post-war world. While Soviet forces in the East relied on fear and retribution, the Americans wielded empathy and organization. Their food convoys became symbols of a different kind of power, the power to heal. "They conquered us," wrote one German woman in a 1946 diary, "but they also taught us to live again." Bundesarchiv. Civilian Diary Collection, 1946. Engineers and factory workers, too, became silent heroes. In occupied Germany, U.S. Army engineers repaired more than 1,000 bakeries and flour mills, often using salvaged parts. Technicians from General Electric helped restore electricity grids to power refrigeration units, while Caterpillar bulldozers, fresh off the Pacific production line, cleared rubble to reopen food depots. What began as an emergency relief effort evolved into a blueprint for modern humanitarian logistics. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Bulletin, 1946. Meanwhile, the psychological effects rippled through the defeated population. American psychologists from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey interviewed hundreds of civilians and captured soldiers. Their findings stunned policymakers. Gratitude, not resentment, dominated. "Most Germans express astonishment that their conquerors feed them," the report read. This has accelerated the breakdown of Nazi belief and increased willingness to cooperate with occupation authorities. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Psychological Warfare Division, 1946. It was a weapon of peace, soft, invisible, but absolute. By 1947, the feeding operations merged into the Marshall Plan, turning wartime logistics into peacetime reconstruction. The same supply lines that once delivered ammunition now carried wheat, machinery, and textbooks. For the first time in history, a victorious army rebuilt the enemy's society rather than dismantling it, and at its heart lay one simple act, the handing of food instead of bullets. But the legacy ran deeper still. The American approach in post-war Germany became the template for future military occupations, from Korea to Iraq, where stability meant more than victory, and food became as strategic as firepower. Modern doctrines of hearts and minds, civil military operations, and humanitarian intervention all trace their lineage to those ruined German streets where soldiers handed out rations to bewildered civilians. Defense Policy Analysis, 1989. As one German priest later said in a post-war sermon, "We expected the devil. We met men." Parish Records, Würzburg, 1946. That line would echo through the decades, shaping how generations remembered the end of the Second World War. It wasn't the battles alone that defined the American victory, but the moral calculus that followed. Compassion, it turned out, could be as disarming as firepower. The sight of a G.I. sharing his last chocolate bar with a starving child became more powerful than any propaganda. It silenced hate, dismantled lies, and seeded trust where none should have survived. In those moments, amid the ruins of empire, a new world order was born. Not from dominance, but from decency. And so the story of the American soldier in Germany ends not in blood, but in bread. Her testament to a truth forged in rubble and mercy, that the mightiest weapon in war is not always the gun, it is the hand that feeds.